There's a specific kind of person who watches the camera feed at 2 in the morning, not the security guard getting paid minimum wage to stare at empty hallways, the person sitting in their bedroom, watching a digital screen flicker between rooms full of animatronic animals that want them dead. The person who knows exactly when Foxy will sprint down the hall, who's memorized which audio cue means Freddy has moved, who can identify the breathing pattern of Bonnie standing just outside the left door. They've died here hundreds of times. They know every jump scare by heart, and they keep coming back. Most people bounce off Five Nights at Freddy's within an hour. The jump scares are too sudden, the mechanics too punishing, the premise too absurd. Haunted robots hunting a night guard sounds like a joke until you're actually sitting in that office, watching the power drain, knowing something is moving through the dark towards you. Then it stops being funny. For most players, it becomes frustrating. But for a certain subset, something else happens entirely. The game stops being about surviving and starts being about understanding. The mechanics become a language. The lore becomes an obsession. And somewhere in that transformation, Five Nights at Freddy's stops being a horror game and becomes something closer to therapy. This video is analytical commentary and critical interpretation examining why specific people connect so deeply with Freddy's, what psychological needs the series fulfills that other horror games don't, and what those connections reveal about trauma, control, and the ways we process helplessness through fiction. By the end, you'll understand why someone would voluntarily subject themselves to the same jump scares night after night, why the community treats solving the lore like archaeological excavation, and why this series about dead children stuffed into animatronic suits has become comfort media for people carrying specific kinds of damage. If something in this video resonates with you, drop a comment about which detail connected, which moment made something click. You can also suggest topics for future deep dives. Some of the best video ideas have come from you all. So now get comfortable, turn the lights down low, and let's begin. Chapter 1. The Mechanics of Fear. Five Nights at Freddy's doesn't ease you into its world. The first game drops you in an office with 2 doors, a tablet showing security cameras, and a power meter draining towards 0. There's no tutorial beyond a phone call from someone who used to work your shift, casually mentioning that the animatronics wander at night and might try to stuff you into a spare suit full of metal and wires. Then he hangs up, and you're alone with the sound of your own breathing and the grainy footage of Freddy Fazbear staring directly into the camera. The genius of this design isn't the jump scares themselves. Jump scares are easy. Any game can make a loud noise and flash something scary on screen. What Scott Cawthon understood, and what most players don't consciously recognize, is that jump scares only work if you've been taught to fear them. Freddy's entire mechanical structure exists to condition you into a state where the actual scare becomes almost irrelevant. The anticipation does all the heavy lifting. Your job every night is surveillance and resource management. Check the cameras to track which animatronics have moved. Close the doors when they get too close. Use the lights to see if something is standing just outside your field of vision. Every action drains power. Run out of power before 6 a.m., and Freddy plays a little song in the dark before killing you. The rule set is brutally simple. The execution is psychologically sophisticated. Consider what the game is actually asking you to do. You must watch the animatronics move closer through rooms that all blur together in grainy monochrome. You must make constant decisions about when to check cameras versus when to conserve power. You must listen for audio cues that something has moved into a position where it can kill you. Bonnie's breathing at the left door, Chica's movement in the kitchen, Foxy's sprint down the hall that gives you maybe 2 seconds to close the door before he breaks through. Every single one of these mechanics is designed to create a specific psychological state. Hypervigilance maintained past the point of sustainability. Hypervigilance is a trauma response. It's what happens when your nervous system gets stuck in threat detection mode, constantly scanning for danger because, at some point in your history, missing a threat had terrible consequences. People who've lived through sustained periods where they had to monitor their environment for signs of incoming harm, abusive households, dangerous neighborhoods, situations where safety required constant vigilance, develop this as a survival adaptation. Their baseline state becomes one of elevated alertness that never quite shuts off. When someone with that kind of nervous system sits down to play Freddy's, something clicks into place. The game is asking them to do exactly what their body already does automatically. Monitor threats, track patterns, stay alert, make split-second decisions about resource allocation. The difference is that in Freddy's, these behaviors have clear rules and predictable outcomes. In real life, hypervigilance is exhausting and often useless because the threats are ambiguous and the rules keep changing. In Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, Bonnie always comes from the left. Chica always comes from the right. Foxy punishes you for not checking on him. Freddy waits until you're vulnerable. The patterns are learnable. The chaos has structure underneath. This creates a strange paradox. The game is stressful, objectively. Your heart rate increases, your palms sweat, the jump scares trigger genuine startle responses. But for people whose bodies exist in that state already, Freddy's isn't creating a new psychological experience. It's replicating an existing one while adding the one thing real trauma never provides. The promise that if you learn the patterns well enough, you can survive. The camera system is particularly revealing. In one room, unable to move, forced to rely on surveillance equipment to track threats you can't directly confront. This is learned helplessness with an instruction manual. You can't fight the animatronics. You can't reason with them. You can't even run away. Your entire defensive toolkit consists of watching them move and closing doors at the right moment. The game takes away every active defense mechanism except observation and timing. For people who've lived through situations where fighting back wasn't an option, where running would have made things worse, where the only survival strategy was watching carefully and timing your responses to someone else's behavior patterns, this mechanic structure is viscerally familiar. The game isn't teaching them something new. It's giving them a context where the skills they developed to survive actual helplessness suddenly have clear application and measurable success. The power meter adds the final psychological component, scarcity. You have limited resources to make it through the night. Every defensive action costs power. Watch cameras too much and you'll run out. Close doors too early and you'll run out. Wait too long and something will kill you. The optimal strategy requires precise calibration between paranoia and conservation, between action and inaction. You must exist in a state of managed fear, never relaxing completely but never panicking wastefully. This is the psychological reality of living with resource scarcity. People who've grown up poor, who've had to make every decision through the lens of, can I afford this? Who've learned that running out means consequences far worse than temporary discomfort. They already understand this calculation intimately. Freddy's takes that same decision-making framework and applies it to survival horror. The result is a game that feels less like entertainment and more like a simulation of existing psychological conditions. But here's what separates Freddy's from simply being a stress simulator. The night's end. You make it to 6 a.m. and the shift is over. You survived. The game explicitly rewards you for enduring the psychological pressure it created. This is the crucial element that transforms mechanical stress into something people return to voluntarily. Real hypervigilance doesn't get validated with a completion screen. Real resource scarcity doesn't end at 6 a.m. with a paycheck and the promise that tomorrow is another chance. Freddy's provides closure that trauma responses never receive. The jump scares themselves function differently than in most horror games. When Freddy appears in your office at 0% power, When Foxy crashes through the door you closed half a second too late. When you flip up the camera and Bonnie is suddenly standing in your office. These aren't random. They're failure states. The jump scare is feedback. It's the game telling you that your pattern recognition failed, your timing was off, your resource management miscalculated. And because they're tied to specific mechanical failures, they become predictable. Not in timing, but in causation. This predictability matters enormously. One of the most destabilizing aspects of trauma is its randomness. The way terrible things can happen without warning or clear cause. Freddy's takes the aesthetics of random violence, animatronics suddenly attacking, and reveals them to be completely systematic. Nothing random is happening. You died because you made a specific mistake in a learnable system. That transformation from chaos to pattern, from helplessness to failed execution, is psychologically powerful. Players who master Freddy's often describe a specific feeling. The game stops being scary and starts being a puzzle. The animatronics stop being threats and start being obstacles with movement patterns to memorize. Freddy's laugh that plays when he moves through cameras becomes less a scare tactic and more an audio cue, confirming your internal tracking. Foxy's sprint becomes an expected consequence of ignoring Pirate Cove for too long. The whole experience shifts from horror to something closer to rhythm game execution, where you're managing cooldowns and timing responses. But that shift from being scared to feeling confident is exactly what makes people keep playing. They're proving to themselves that the chaos can be understood, that helplessness can be overcome through study and practice, that if you watch carefully enough and learn the patterns thoroughly enough, you can survive things that seemed impossible at first. The game becomes evidence that their hypervigilance has purpose, that their threat monitoring isn't paranoia, but preparation. Game design critics have noted how Freddy's weaves failure and fear together into a feedback loop that increases tension more effectively than traditional horror games. When you die in most horror games, there's a disconnect. You respawn, you try again. The scare loses impact. In Freddy's, dying is the scare. They're the same moment. This creates an association between mechanical failure and psychological impact that makes players desperately want to avoid mistakes, which increases stress, which makes mistakes more likely, which makes success more satisfying. The mechanical loop is elegant. Stress creates mistakes. Mistakes create jump scares. Jump scares create more stress, but survival creates validation. And for people whose nervous systems are already wired for this kind of high alert pattern monitoring, the loop isn't creating a new psychological state, it's channeling an existing one into something that finally, temporarily, makes sense. That explains why the mechanics work. That explains why certain people can tolerate them while others can't. But it doesn't explain why they'd want to. Why someone would voluntarily subject themselves to simulated hypervigilance when they already live with the real thing. Why the aesthetic would be dead children and malfunctioning entertainment robots. Why the setting would be the most mundane kind of childhood nostalgia. Pizza parlors and arcade games and birthday parties twisted into something threatening. The answer to that requires understanding what Five Nights at Freddy's is actually about underneath the jump scares and mechanics, and that means entering the lore, where the story stops being about a night guard surviving his shift and becomes something far more uncomfortable. Chapter 2: The Pattern Recognition Trap. The second night is when most people realize Freddy's might be more complicated than it appears. Phone guy's messages start referencing an incident, something about a bite, rumors about what happens after hours. The newspapers on the walls mention children going missing. There are hints that whatever is animating these robots to hunt you at night isn't mechanical malfunction. It's something else, something connected to those missing children, something that makes the whole premise shift from scary robots to you're trapped in a building with the vengeful spirits of murdered kids. For most players, this lore is background decoration. They're too focused on surviving to read between the lines of Phone Guy's increasingly nervous voicemails or notice the details hidden in the office decorations. But for the players who connect deeply with Freddy's, the lore stops being background and becomes the primary text. The gameplay becomes the excuse to access more story. And somewhere in that shift, Five Nights at Freddy's transforms from a game you play to a mystery you solve. The original Freddy's doesn't explain itself. You piece together what happened at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza through implication and scattered details. Newspaper clippings visible on the wall between nights mention the missing children incident. Phone Guy's calls reference the bite of 87. The animatronics' behavior, their aggression, their focus on night guards, the way they try to stuff you into a suit, suggests they're not just malfunctioning but operating on some kind of vengeful logic. The game trusts you to assemble these fragments into a narrative that's never explicitly stated. Someone murdered children at this restaurant. Their bodies were hidden inside the animatronic suits, and now their spirits possess the machines, hunting anyone they perceive as a threat. This narrative structure, revealing horror through fragments rather than exposition, isn't just stylistic, it's psychological engineering. When you tell someone a complete story, they consume it passively. When you give someone pieces and make them assemble the story themselves, they become invested in a completely different way. The story stops being something they received and becomes something they discovered. Their brain starts looking for patterns. Every detail becomes potentially significant. Every background element might be a clue. The act of interpretation becomes addictive because it activates the same reward systems that pattern recognition evolved to trigger. Human beings are pattern recognition machines. Our brains are constantly processing input and looking for connections, cause and effect, signal in the noise. This was survival adaptation. Spotting the rustle in grass that means predator. Identifying which plants are safe to eat. Reading social cues to navigate tribal dynamics. Our ancestors who were better at pattern recognition survived to pass on genes. The ones who missed patterns died, so our brains evolved to find pattern recognition deeply satisfying at a neurological level. When you spot a pattern, your brain releases dopamine. You get a hit of reward chemicals for successfully connecting information. Freddy's is dopamine bait for pattern recognition-obsessed brains. Every game adds new information that contradicts, complicates, or expands on previous details. The second game is a prequel showing an earlier location. The third game reveals what happened to the killer. The fourth game might be a child's nightmares, or might be something else entirely. Sister Location introduces a new company making different animatronics for different purposes. Pizzeria Simulator reveals Henry Emily and his final plan. Every new game changes how you understand the previous games. This is the pattern recognition trap. Every new piece of information makes the overall picture more complex, which means there are more patterns to find, more connections to make, more details that might be significant. The lore becomes fractal. The deeper you look, the more there is to see. And because Scott Cawthon deliberately leaves gaps and ambiguities, there's always room for interpretation, always another theory to construct, always new evidence to consider. For people whose brains are already hyperactive pattern recognition engines, people who've had to learn to read subtext in dangerous situations, who've developed the ability to predict behavior based on tiny cues, who've spent years analyzing inconsistencies to understand what's really happening beneath surface explanations. Freddy's lore is perfectly calibrated to hijack that cognitive machinery. Every ambiguity is an invitation. Every contradiction is a challenge. Every new game is an opportunity to prove that you've understood something other people missed. The community that formed around solving Freddy's lore represents this in concentrated form. Players compare notes, analyze minigames frame by frame, create elaborate timelines tracking events across decades. They debate whether the crying child is Michael Afton or a separate character. They argue about whether Golden Freddy and Fredbear are the same animatronic. They construct theories about Remnant and how soul possession works in this universe. The dedication to solving these puzzles would seem absurd if you don't understand what's actually happening psychologically. These players aren't just fans enjoying a story, they're people whose brains have learned to survive by finding patterns in chaos, and Freddy's provides infinite chaos to organize. The satisfaction isn't really about being right or solving the mystery. It's about the process itself, the feeling of pieces clicking together, of information that seemed random suddenly revealing structure, of chaos being tamed through analysis. This creates a specific psychological profile for hardcore Freddy fans. They're often people who've developed pattern recognition skills as trauma response. Children of alcoholics learn to read subtle mood indicators to predict when a parent might become violent. People who've been gaslit learn to track inconsistencies to figure out what's actually true. Anyone who's had to navigate unstable situations learns to spot patterns that predict danger. These skills are survival adaptations that become cognitive habits. When you've trained your brain to compulsively seek patterns, you can't easily turn that off. In everyday life, this pattern-seeking behavior often doesn't have a productive outlet. You end up overanalyzing social interactions, seeing conspiracies in coincidences, exhausting yourself trying to figure out systems that don't actually have hidden logic. But in Freddy lore, every pattern you find is real because Scott Cawthon put it there intentionally. Every detail matters because it's part of deliberate design. Your pattern recognition compulsion finally has a context where it's not paranoia or overthinking. It's exactly the right cognitive tool for the job at hand. The timeline is a perfect example. Across multiple games, DLCs, books, and spin-offs, Freddy spans from the 1970s through the present day and beyond. Events include the founding of Fredbear's Family Diner, the missing children incident in 1985, the bite of '83 involving the crying child, Sister Location's underground facility, the fire at Fazbear's Fright in 2023, the Pizzeria Simulator's final confrontation, and security breach at the Mega Pizzaplex. Organizing these events into coherent chronology requires tracking details across different media, accounting for retcons and additions, making judgment calls about contradictory evidence. The fact that fans do this, creating detailed timelines, debating specific dates, arguing about the order of events, demonstrates something important. They're not engaging with Freddy's as fiction, they're engaging with it as a historical record that needs to be reconstructed from fragmentary sources. The approach mirrors academic historiography or investigative journalism. You have incomplete information from potentially unreliable sources, and your job is to construct the most coherent narrative possible while acknowledging ambiguities and gaps. This is exactly how people with complex trauma relate to their own histories. Memory becomes fragmented under extreme stress. Traumatic events get encoded differently than normal experiences, often missing context or chronology. Survivors often spend years trying to reconstruct what actually happened to them, piecing together fragments, identifying patterns, building timelines. Freddy lore work mirrors that cognitive process, but in a context where the answers exist, and you're capable of finding them if you work hard enough. William Afton is the central figure requiring this kind of analysis. Across the games, he appears as Purple Guy in minigames, as Springtrap after being killed in the Spring Bonnie suit, as Scraptrap after somehow rebuilding himself, and possibly as Glitchtrap in the VR game. He's revealed as co-founder of Fazbear Entertainment alongside Henry Emily. He murdered multiple children, including Charlotte Emily outside Fredbear's Family Diner in 1983, and 5 more children in the missing children incident of 1985. His victims' spirits possess the animatronics. His daughter Elizabeth was killed by Circus Baby. His youngest son died in the bite of 83. His oldest son Michael became the protagonist, trying to undo his father's damage. Understanding William requires tracking his appearances across multiple games, interpreting mini-games with no dialogue, making connections between different sprite representations, and constructing psychological profiles from behavioral evidence. He's never directly explained. This construction of William Afton's character and history is detective work. Players are analyzing evidence, testing theories, building cases, and for people who've had to do similar detective work to understand their own abusers, tracking behavior patterns, making sense of contradictions, figuring out motivations that were never explained, this cognitive process feels natural. The difference is that in Freddy's, the abuser is fictional and the mystery is solvable. All the pattern recognition effort actually leads somewhere instead of running into the fundamental inscrutability of another person's cruelty. The books complicate everything further. The novel trilogy follows different continuity, but introduces concepts that might apply to the game timeline. The Fazbear, Fright's stories exist in an ambiguous relationship to game canon. Some events and characters clearly matter to understanding the games, but which ones and how much is subject to interpretation. This creates an additional layer of pattern-seeking challenge. Fans must decide which information transfers between continuities and which doesn't. This ambiguity frustrates some people and delights others. The people it delights are typically those whose brains are already trained to navigate ambiguous information systems. When you've grown up in an environment where the rules keep changing, where what was true yesterday might not be true today, where you have to figure out how systems work without reliable guidance, you develop cognitive flexibility about information sources. You learn to assess reliability, weigh contradictory evidence, form working theories you're prepared to revise. Freddy's rewards exactly this kind of thinking. Scott Cawthon has never provided a complete, definitive explanation of the lore. He clarified specific points, confirmed some theories, gently corrected others, but he's maintained ambiguity as a core feature of the series. This means there's no point where you can say you've completely solved it. There's always another layer, another interpretation, another detail that might change everything. The pattern recognition work never ends, which means the dopamine hits never stop. Chapter 3. The Comfort of Documented Horror. The lore of Five Nights at Freddy's isn't just complicated, it's deliberately documented. The games include newspaper clippings, posters with hidden text, phone calls that serve as audio logs, mini-games that reveal backstory. Security Breach adds collectible messages and computer terminals. The movie includes Easter eggs and visual references that confirm or complicate game timeline details. Every piece of media adds to the archive. The franchise doesn't just have a story, it has a documentary record of that story scattered across multiple formats. This matters because documentation transforms horror from overwhelming to manageable. When terrible things happen and there's no record, no one believes you, no evidence exists, the event lives only in your memory. The horror stays fluid and uncontained. But when horror is documented, it becomes something you can point to. Something with external validation, something that can be studied and understood rather than just endured. People who connect deeply with Freddy's often have histories where their own trauma went undocumented, family abuse that happened behind closed doors, institutional failures that were never officially acknowledged, experiences that left no physical evidence and produced no witnesses. When you've lived through something terrible that the world treats as though it didn't happen, you develop a particular hunger for documentation. Evidence becomes psychologically vital because it's the difference between "this happened to me" and I might be making this up. Five Nights at Freddy's provides meticulous documentation of every terrible thing that happens in its universe. Children go missing, and there are newspaper articles about it. William Afton murders Charlotte Emily, and there's a mini-game showing exactly how it happened. The animatronics are possessed by dead children, and you can track the timeline of how those possessions occurred. Henry Emily's final plan is explained through his recorded speech in Pizzeria Simulator. Nothing happens off-screen without eventually being revealed through some form of documentation. This creates a universe where horror is terrible, but knowable. The children who died at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza were murdered, stuffed into animatronic suits, and had their deaths covered up by the company. That's nightmare fuel. But it's documented nightmare fuel. You can track which child possesses which animatronic. You can identify when and where each murder occurred. You can understand the mechanism of possession through the lore about Remnant and Agony. The horror is complete, but so is the record. For someone whose own trauma exists in the realm of "no one would believe me" or "I don't have proof," this fictional world where every terrible thing eventually gets documented offers strange comfort. The children in Freddy's died horribly, but at least their deaths matter enough to be recorded. At least someone is tracking what happened. At least the story doesn't end with everyone pretending nothing occurred. The spirits possessing the animatronics reinforce this documentation theme. They're not random hauntings. Each spirit has identity, history, and specific grievance. Charlotte Emily becomes the puppet and helps other spirits possess the animatronics. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy, the five children from the Missing Children incident, possess Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy respectively. Elizabeth Afton possesses Circus Baby. The crying child might possess Golden Freddy or might become someone else entirely, depending on which interpretation you follow. These aren't just ghosts, they're documented victims with names and histories and specific relationships to the animatronics they possess. The series treats them as individuals rather than generic horror elements. And for people who've felt erased by their own trauma, who've felt reduced to symptoms, rather than treated as people with stories, this matters enormously. The series is saying that the victims count, that their individual identities persist after death, that someone is keeping track of who they were and what was done to them. William Afton serves as the documented abuser. He's not an abstract force of evil or a mysterious killer whose identity remains unknown. Across the games, his history gets filled. He co-founded the company with Henry Emily. He was a father whose own children suffered because of him. One son killed by animatronic, one daughter killed by animatronic he designed, one son condemned to undo his father's damage. He built technology specifically to harm children. He kept killing even after his first murders, compulsively returning to his pattern. He achieved a horrible form of immortality by being trapped in Spring Bonnie suit, then kept coming back as Springtrap and Scraptrap and possibly Glitchtrap. Every aspect of his monstrosity is tracked, documented, and eventually exposed. He doesn't get to hide. The games systematically reveal who he was, what he did, and the specific mechanisms of his evil. This is fantasy for people whose own abusers never faced documentation, never got exposed, never had their patterns revealed to anyone who would believe it. In the real world, abusers often escape consequences because no one documented their behavior thoroughly enough. In Freddy's universe, William Afton's evil is so meticulously documented that players can create detailed timelines of his crimes. Henry Emily's role provides the other side of documentation, the witness who eventually takes action. He was William's business partner and friend. He didn't initially know what William was doing. His own daughter Charlotte was William's first victim. By Pizzeria Simulator, Henry has spent decades investigating, understanding, and planning how to end what his former partner started. His final speech is a recorded message that serves as both documentation of everything that happened and a plan to finally contain the damage. Henry represents the person who believed the victims, who tracked the evidence, who built a case and took action. He's the witness who made the documentation matter by using it to achieve something. For people who desperately wanted someone to believe them, to investigate what happened, to take their side and do something about the people who hurt them, Henry's character arc offers a specific kind of wish fulfillment. He's proof that sometimes the witnesses care enough to act. The way the community engages with documenting the lore mirrors this need for thorough record keeping. Fan wikis don't just summarize the games, they catalog every detail. Every newspaper article is transcribed, every minigame is mapped, every voice line is analyzed. The community has created comprehensive documentation that rivals academic research projects. They're not just enjoying a story, they're preserving a record with the thoroughness of archivists handling primary historical sources. This archival impulse reveals something about what the series provides psychologically. For people who've experienced undocumented trauma, the act of documentation itself becomes meaningful. Creating complete records, ensuring nothing gets lost or forgotten, making sure every detail is preserved. This work serves a psychological function beyond entertainment. It's practicing the thing they wish someone had done for their own experiences. The books expand the documentation even further. The original novel trilogy follows Charlie, Henry's daughter, who survived as a robot built by her father to replace the daughter William murdered. The Fazbear Fright stories explore different aspects of the horror through standalone narratives. The tales from the Pizzaplex books connect to Security Breach timeline. Each new book adds details, confirms theories, or introduces concepts that reshape understanding of the game timeline. Some people find this overwhelming, too much information across too many formats. But for the core audience, it's perfect. More documentation means more to analyze. More formats means more opportunities to cross-reference and find patterns. The franchise has created an ever-expanding archive that rewards people who engage with it at archival depth. Security Breach represents the documentation impulse taken to logical conclusion. The game includes collectible messages scattered throughout the Pizzaplex, audio logs from therapists treating various characters, computer terminals with emails and incident reports. You're not just playing through the story, you're collecting the documentary evidence that explains the story. The gameplay itself becomes archival research, gathering documents that reveal what's really happening at this location. The therapist tapes are particularly significant. They document Vanessa's sessions as she's being manipulated by Glitchtrap, recording the process of her psychological corruption in real time through professional psychiatric notes. For people who've been through mental health systems, who've had their experiences documented in clinical language that captured facts but missed meaning, these tapes represent documentation that actually matters. They're evidence of harm being done, recorded by someone whose job was to notice exactly this kind of thing. That the therapist ultimately fails to protect Vanessa doesn't erase the significance of the documentation. The record exists. Someone was paying attention. The harm was noted even if it wasn't stopped. This mirrors real experiences of people whose trauma was documented by teachers, doctors, or counselors who noticed something wrong but couldn't or didn't intervene effectively. The documentation doesn't prevent the harm, but it validates that the harm was real and observable. The movie adds another layer by bringing the story into a new medium with its own documentation style. Visual details replace minigame sprites. Background elements confirm timeline details. The casting of specific actors, the design of the animatronics, the way locations are realized, all of this becomes new information to document and analyze. The film isn't just adaptation, It's additional primary source material for the archive. What separates this from simple completionism or collector mentality is the emotional investment in ensuring nothing gets lost. Completionists want to own everything. Archivists want to preserve everything. The Freddy's community functions more like archivists. Their concern isn't possession but preservation. They're making sure that every detail is recorded, cataloged, and accessible. They're creating the comprehensive record that they wish existed for their own experiences. This explains why the community reacts so strongly to retcons or contradictions. It's not just frustration about continuity errors, it's the specific anxiety of people who've had their own documented experiences questioned or invalidated. When Scott Cawthon changes details between games, when new information contradicts old information, when the canon becomes unclear, it activates the same psychological distress as having your documented trauma dismissed as unreliable or exaggerated. The debates about what's canon and what's not aren't pedantic arguments. They're people fighting to maintain the integrity of the documentary record because they know viscerally what happens when records get discredited. If the documentation can't be trusted, if the archive becomes corrupted by contradictions, if the official account keeps changing, then what's the point of documentation at all? The community's insistence on canon purity is about protecting the thing that makes the horror manageable, the reliability of the record. But documentation alone doesn't explain the deep connection. Horror that's merely documented is still horror. What transforms documented horror into something people return to voluntarily, something that provides comfort despite its content, requires understanding another dimension of what Five Nights at Freddy's offers, the promise that victims eventually get justice. Chapter 4. The Dead Children Get Their Revenge. The jump scares in Five Nights at Freddy's aren't random violence, they're revenge. When Freddy appears in your office and screams in your face, when Bonnie catches you and the screen goes black, when Foxy sprints down the hall and crashes through your door, you're not being attacked by malfunctioning equipment. You're being killed by the spirits of murdered children who think you're connected to the person who killed them. This reframes everything about the horror. The animatronics aren't monsters, they're victims. Their aggression isn't evil, it's misdirected justice. They're trying to punish the person who murdered them. But they can't distinguish between William Afton and whoever currently occupies the security office. The tragedy isn't just that children were murdered and stuffed into suits. The tragedy is that their spirits are trapped, still fighting, still trying to stop the person who hurt them, unable to recognize that they're hurting innocent people in the process. This moral complexity is crucial to understanding why certain people connect so deeply with the series. Most horror positions the player as an innocent victim of evil forces. You're the final girl running from the slasher, the civilian caught in supernatural events, the hero fighting monsters. Your moral position is clear. You don't deserve what's happening to you, and your survival is morally good. Five Nights at Freddy's complicates that position. You're the security guard at a restaurant that murdered children and covered it up. You're working for a company that prioritized profit over child safety. You're literally sitting in an office wearing the uniform of the institution that enabled the horror. From the spirit's perspective, you're not innocent. You're part of the system that killed them. Their attacks on you are tragic misidentification, but they're not wrong to be angry at the place you represent. This creates identification, opportunities for people who've been both victim and accidental perpetrator, people whose trauma responses caused them to hurt others, people who worked for institutions that harmed people before they understood the harm, people who were part of systems that enabled abuse even though they personally didn't abuse anyone, people who carry guilt about not stopping things they didn't have power to stop. The security guard position is essentially a collaborative victim. You're not the killer, but you're employed by the apparatus that employed the killer. You didn't murder the children, but you're benefiting from the restaurant that covered up their murders. Your paycheck comes from the same company that prioritized profit over investigating missing children. You're structurally complicit even though you're personally innocent. For people carrying guilt about their position within harmful systems, people who worked at institutions before understanding those institutions' damage, people who were raised by abusers and had to cooperate to survive, people who were present when harm occurred but were too young or powerless to stop it. This security guard position resonates painfully. You understand viscerally that you can be both innocent of direct harm and still connected to systems that caused harm. You understand that victims might perceive you as an enemy, even though you didn't personally hurt them. The spirits attacking you aren't wrong for being angry. They're just wrong about who you are. And that distinction between justified anger and misdirected target is psychologically important. It validates rage while acknowledging its tragedy. It says that victims have every right to their fury, that their desire for revenge is understandable, but that trauma makes it hard to direct that fury accurately. The spirits can't tell the difference between William Afton and Mike Schmidt because death and possession have damaged their ability to make those distinctions. This mirrors the experience of trauma survivors whose own rage sometimes targets the wrong people. You're furious at what was done to you, and that fury is completely justified. But trauma scrambles your threat detection systems. You might react with defensive aggression toward people who remind you of your abuser even though they haven't actually harmed you. You might perceive threats in situations that are actually safe. Your rage is righteous, but trauma makes it imprecise. Five Nights at Freddy's validates both realities simultaneously. The spirits deserve their anger. They deserve to fight back against what was done to them. They deserve to hunt down and destroy the person who murdered them. And you, sitting in that office, don't deserve to die for crimes you didn't commit. Both things are true. The horror is that there's no way to make both things compatible. Michael Afton's storyline takes this complexity even further. Across multiple games, he appears as the protagonist trying to undo his father's damage. He's working security jobs at locations connected to William's crimes. He's deliberately putting himself in danger to help the spirits find peace. He's following his father's trail, trying to find and stop him. And he's doing all this while being William Afton's son, meaning the spirits have even more reason to mistake him for the person who killed them. Michael represents guilt-driven redemption. He didn't murder the children, his father did. But he carries responsibility for his father's crimes simply by being related to him. His entire arc is attempting to fix something he didn't break, apologizing for something he didn't do, putting himself in harm's way because someone from his family needs to make things right. He's trying to give the dead children the justice they deserve, even though achieving that justice might destroy him in the process. For people who feel responsible for harm their family members caused, who carry guilt about things their parents or siblings did, who feel they inherited debts they didn't personally create, Michael's character arc is devastatingly relatable. You're trying to fix things that aren't your fault but feel like your responsibility anyway. You're facing anger that's directed at you because of who you're related to rather than anything you personally did. You're accepting punishment for someone else's crimes because somebody needs to answer for what happened. The ending of Pizzeria Simulator makes this explicit. Henry gathers all the animatronics containing corrupted spirits, gathers Michael, who's been helping him, and burns everything to the ground. Michael has known this is coming. He's accepted that his own destruction is part of the price for ending his father's legacy. He voluntarily walks into the fire because someone from the Afton family needed to face consequences, and William kept escaping them. This self-sacrificial ending should feel noble, but it also feels deeply unfair. Michael spent years trying to undo damage he didn't cause. He helped the spirits. He opposed his father. And his reward is dying in the same fire that finally destroys William. The universe doesn't distinguish between the Afton who caused the horror and the Afton who tried to stop it. Both burn together. For people who've sacrificed themselves trying to fix their family's damage, who've given years of their lives to cleaning up messes they didn't make, who've accepted consequences for other people's actions. This ending validates the unfairness while also providing closure. Michael doesn't get personal redemption or survival, but he gets meaning. His sacrifice actually accomplishes something. The spirits finally get to rest. His father's evil finally ends. It costs Michael everything, but it works. The spirits themselves receive complex characterization as the series continues. Charlotte Emily as the puppet guides and helps other spirits possess the animatronics, giving them the ability to persist after death and seek justice. Cassidy, the spirit possessing Golden Freddy, refuses to rest even after the others have moved on, obsessively tormenting William in what becomes ultimate custom night. Elizabeth Afton as Circus Baby tries to escape and manipulate her way to freedom. Each spirit responds differently to their death and possession. This individuation matters because it resists flattening the victims into interchangeable tragedy. Each child died differently, responded to death differently, and pursues different goals in their possessed state. Charlotte becomes a protector. Cassidy becomes an avenger. Elizabeth becomes a manipulator like her father. They're not just the dead children. They're specific people whose personalities persisted through death and possession. For survivors who felt reduced to their trauma status, who've been treated as interchangeable victims rather than individuals, this characterization of the spirits validates that trauma victims remain people with distinct personalities and responses. Being murdered didn't erase who these children were. Possession didn't turn them into identical ghosts. They each brought their individual selves into their undeath. The Happiest Day minigame provides eventual peace. The 5 missing children gather for a birthday party, each wearing the mask of the animatronic they possess. One by one, their spirits fade as they move on, leaving the masks behind. It's quiet and melancholy, and offers the thing the entire series has been building toward: the dead children getting to rest. This ending matters enormously because it promises that trauma, even the worst trauma, doesn't have to be permanent. The spirits were trapped for decades, unable to move on, stuck in their anger and pain and confusion. But eventually, they found peace. Eventually, they got to leave. The horror that possessed them for so long released its grip, and they got to be children again for one moment before fading into whatever comes after. For people who fear they'll be trapped in their trauma forever, who worry that damage this deep can never heal, who question whether peace is possible after what they've endured, Happiest Day is proof that even the worst circumstances can eventually end. The spirits suffered profoundly. They were murdered, trapped, confused, and angry for decades, and they still got to rest. They still got their moment of peace. They still got to move forward. The series could have ended with permanent haunting, with spirits trapped forever in their anger. That would be more realistic in some ways. Trauma doesn't always resolve neatly, but Five Nights at Freddy's chooses to offer eventual peace. Not immediate, not easy, not without sacrifice from people like Henry and Michael, but it is possible, achievable, real. That promise that the dead children eventually get both revenge and rest, that their trauma ends even though it can't be undone, is what transforms the series from horror into something closer to myth. It's telling a story about the worst thing that can happen to children and promising that even that worst thing doesn't have to be permanent. The damage was real, the suffering was real, and the eventual peace is real too. But there's one more element we need to understand to fully grasp why certain people return to this series obsessively, voluntarily subjecting themselves to horror they've already experienced dozens of times. Why the jump scares remain effective even when you know exactly when they're coming. Why do people describe Freddy's as comfort media despite its content being objectively disturbing? The answer has to do with control, with powerlessness, and with what it means to choose your own fear. Chapter 5. Choosing Your Cage. There's a specific psychological phenomenon that happens when you play Five Nights at Freddy's for the 15th time. You know the mechanics perfectly. You've memorized the movement patterns. You can predict exactly when Foxy will sprint down the hall, exactly which cameras to check to track Freddy's progression, exactly how much power you need to conserve to make it through the night. The jump scares still trigger your startle response because that's physiological. Loud noise and sudden movement activate your amygdala before your cortex can remind you this is just pixels. But the fear is different now. You're not afraid of the unknown. You're afraid of failing execution on patterns you understand completely. This transformation from uncertain horror to performance anxiety is exactly the point. The game has taught you that chaos has structure, that the things hunting you follow rules, that if you learn the system thoroughly enough, you can survive. And now, returning for the 15th time, you're not testing whether you can survive. You're proving to yourself that you can maintain competence under pressure. You're demonstrating that your pattern recognition works, that your hypervigilance serves a purpose, that you can manage threats effectively when you understand the system. This is control through mastery. You can't control whether the animatronics exist or whether they're hunting you. Those are givens of the game state. But you can control your own execution. You can check the cameras at optimal intervals. You can manage power efficiently. You can close doors at the right moment. The horror remains, but you've proven you can navigate it successfully. You've transformed helplessness into competence through repetition and study. For people whose trauma involved absolute powerlessness, situations where nothing they did mattered, where fighting back made things worse, where survival was entirely dependent on someone else's choices, this experience of transforming helplessness into mastery is psychologically powerful. You start the game unable to survive the first night. Through learning and practice, you reach the point where you can beat Night 5. Custom difficulties, hard mode. The progression from incompetent to expert happens because you chose to engage with the fear repeatedly until you understood it. That choice matters more than the mastery itself. Nobody is forcing you to play. You could stop at any time. Every time you die and restart, you're choosing to try again. Every time you boot up the game knowing exactly how stressful it will be, you're choosing to expose yourself to that stress. The fear stops being something that happens to you and becomes something you've chosen to experience under controlled conditions. This is exposure therapy you're conducting on yourself. Clinical exposure therapy for anxiety disorders works by gradually exposing someone to feared stimuli in safe environments until the fear response diminishes. You're afraid of spiders, so you start by looking at pictures, then videos, then being in the same room as the spider in a container, gradually working up to exposure that would have been overwhelming initially. The principle is that fear maintained through avoidance decreases through repeated, controlled exposure. Five Nights at Freddy's functions similarly. You expose yourself to jump scares and predatory threats, and resource scarcity and hypervigilance demands repeatedly. In an environment where the stakes are you restart the game, rather than you suffer real consequences. Each exposure proves that you can endure the fear and survive. Each successful night builds evidence that you're capable of navigating a threat successfully. The game never stops being stressful. Your heart rate still increases, you still jump at scares, you still feel relief when you make it to 6 a.m., but the stress becomes familiar, predictable, chosen. You know what you're signing up for every time you press start. The fear belongs to you now rather than being something forced upon you. This ownership of fear explains why people describe the series as comforting despite its horror. Comfort doesn't mean pleasant or relaxing. Comfort means familiar, predictable, something that fits you correctly. A comfortable horror game is one where you understand the fear completely, where you've mapped its contours, where you know exactly what will happen and have proven you can handle it. The horror remains horrible, but it's yours. You've domesticated it through understanding and repetition. For people whose real trauma involved chaos they couldn't predict or control, having horror that's completely predictable and controllable serves a psychological function. It's proof that fear can be mastered, those terrible things can be survived, that you can voluntarily face something frightening and come out intact. Every time you survive a night, you're giving your nervous system evidence that contradicts what trauma taught it. That terrible situations don't always end in destruction. That you have agency even in frightening circumstances. That fear itself isn't lethal. The loop of dying and restarting reinforces this lesson. When you fail, when the jump scare gets you, when you run out of power and Freddy kills you, the consequence is you try again. Failure isn't permanent. Death in this context doesn't mean the end. You respawn, you restart, you apply what you learned from failure. The game teaches resilience through repeated failure followed by continued opportunity. This is fundamentally different from trauma logic. Trauma teaches that failure has permanent, devastating consequences. Those mistakes mean destruction, that you don't get second chances. Five Nights at Freddy's contradicts those lessons with every respawn. You failed, and you're still here. You died, and you get to try again. Failure is information rather than ending. The custom night. Options extend this control even further. You can adjust difficulty settings, manipulate which animatronics are active, create your own nightmare challenges, or make the game trivially easy. You have complete control over the parameters of your fear. Want to face all the animatronics at maximum difficulty? You can choose that. Want to fight only Freddy at minimum challenge? You can choose that too. The game hands you the difficulty slider and says, decide how much fear you want to experience right now. This level of control is fantasy for people whose real fear came without options. You didn't get to choose your trauma difficulty. You didn't get to adjust which threats were active. You didn't get to opt out when it became too much. But in Freddy's, you control every parameter. The game serves you fear exactly how you want it. No more, no less, calibrated to what you can handle right now. Ultimate Custom Night makes this explicit. 50 animatronics with individual difficulty sliders, from 0 to 20, letting you create combinations ranging from impossible to effortless. You can design your own nightmare with precision, making it exactly as overwhelming or manageable as you choose. And when it becomes too much, you can decrease difficulty or simply stop playing. The power belongs to you completely. Security Breach adds another dimension by making the game less punishing mechanically. You can hide, run, and navigate through the Pizzaplex with more agency than earlier games allowed. The horror is still present. Vanny is hunting you. The animatronics are corrupted. The facility is dangerous. But you have more options for responding. The game gives you back some active defense capability that earlier entries denied. Some longtime fans initially criticized this as making the game less scary, but for many players it provided exactly the expansion of agency they'd been craving. You're still trapped in a dangerous facility facing threats you can't truly fight, but you have a flashlight, hiding spots, and the ability to run. The helplessness is reduced without being eliminated. You're still vulnerable, but you're not completely powerless. This gradual restoration of agency across the series mirrors therapeutic progression for trauma. You start in complete helplessness. The first game gives you almost no options. Gradually, each sequel adds slightly more agency. By Security Breach, you're still scared, but you're moving through the environment with purpose rather than cowering in one room. The series gradually teaches you that you can reclaim agency without eliminating the reality of danger. The movie represents this evolution in a different format. Mike Schmidt has agency. He fights back, makes decisions, protects Abby. He's not helplessly watching camera feeds. He's an active protagonist navigating threats through action rather than purely defense. The film gives audiences what the games initially withheld: a protagonist who can punch back. And for fans who've done the therapeutic work of reclaiming their own agency, seeing that progression represented on screen validates their journey. But there's one final element that makes the series specifically powerful for people with trauma histories. One aspect we haven't fully addressed yet. It's not just about the mechanics, or the lore, or the control. It's about what the series is actually about at its core. And that requires understanding what William Afton represents, beyond just being the killer in a horror franchise. Chapter 6. The Banality of William Afton. William Afton isn't a supernatural evil. He's not possessed by demons. He's not insane in the sense of being disconnected from reality. He understands exactly what he's doing when he lures children to back rooms and murders them. He knows the difference between right and wrong. He simply doesn't care. He prioritizes his goals: achieving immortality, advancing his experiments with Remnant, satisfying whatever compulsion drives him to keep killing, over the lives of children who trust adults to protect them. This makes him more frightening than any monster could be. Monsters are aberrations. Monsters exist outside normal human experience. But William Afton is a father, a business owner, a co-founder of a successful restaurant chain. He shakes hands with parents dropping their kids off for birthday parties. He designs animatronics that bring joy to children during the day, then uses those same machines as tools for murder at night. He's respectable, successful, integrated into his community, and he's murdering children in the back room. The horror of William Afton is the horror of the trusted adult who betrays that trust. He represents every youth pastor, every coach, every family friend, every teacher, every neighbor who seemed normal and safe but was using that facade to access victims. He's the predator who hides in plain sight, who benefits from people's inability to believe that someone so ordinary could do something so monstrous. For people who've been victimized by trusted adults, whose abusers were respected community members, whose family members who hurt them maintained perfect public personas, whose predators were people everyone else liked and defended, William Afton is devastatingly familiar. He's the specific horror of watching someone who hurt you receive praise, trust, and continued access to potential victims because nobody believes that person could be dangerous. The series never explains why William kills. There are theories. He's experimenting with Remnant. He's trying to achieve immortality. He's driven by the death of his younger son. But none of these explanations feel sufficient. They're rationalizations for something that doesn't have rational motivation. Scott Cawthon deliberately withholds the why because the why doesn't actually matter. William kills because something in him is broken or absent in ways that make children's suffering irrelevant to him. The specifics of his motivation are less important than the fact that he keeps choosing to harm children when he could choose literally anything else. This refusal to provide a satisfying explanation is frustrating to some fans who want complete understanding, but it's psychologically accurate to how predators actually function. When you dig into the histories of people who abuse children, you rarely find explanations that make sense. You find people who had opportunities to make different choices at every stage and consistently chose harm. Trying to understand the why often leads to empathizing with the abuser in ways that distort moral clarity. Five Nights at Freddy's refuses that trap. William Afton's motivations remain opaque. What's documented is his behavior: the murders, the cover-ups, the continued killing, the way he uses his own children as extensions of his experiments. The series focuses on what he did and what consequences followed, not on making him comprehensible or sympathetic. He remains what he is: someone who murdered children and destroyed families for reasons that don't justify or excuse anything. Henry Emily serves as the contrasting figure. He co-founded the company with William, designed animatronics, wanted to bring joy to children. When he discovers what William has done, that his business partner murdered his daughter, that the company they built together became infrastructure for child murder, Henry spends the rest of his life trying to undo the damage. He doesn't make excuses. He doesn't minimize. He accepts responsibility for his failure to notice what William was doing and dedicates himself to ending it. This dynamic between William and Henry represents something crucial about institutional abuse. William is the individual perpetrator, the person directly causing harm. Henry is the institution that enabled him by not recognizing the danger, by trusting someone who shouldn't have been trusted, by building systems that William could exploit. Henry isn't evil like William, but his failure to protect the children who trusted his establishments makes him complicit in ways he can never fully escape. The restaurants themselves become complicit. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza continues operating after children go missing. The company covers up incidents to protect their brand. They prioritize profit over investigation. They know something is wrong. The animatronics smell bad. They're leaking fluids, they're acting strangely. But they keep using them because replacing them would be expensive. The company values money more than children's safety, and that choice enables William's continued access to victims. This institutional complicity mirrors real cases where organizations protected predators to avoid scandal, churches that moved abusive priests to new parishes rather than reporting them to police, schools that quietly fired teachers for inappropriate conduct rather than documenting it, youth organizations that settled accusations quietly to protect their reputations. The pattern is consistent. Institutions protect themselves first, and children pay the price for that choice. Fazbear Entertainment in the series represents this institutional evil perfectly. They're not cartoonishly villainous. They're doing what corporations do, managing liability, protecting brand value, minimizing costs. The fact that children died becomes a PR problem rather than a moral catastrophe. The fact that animatronics are possessed by murder, victims become something to cover up rather than address. The company continues opening new locations, continues using the same designs, continues prioritizing profit until Henry finally burns it all down. For people who've been failed by institutions, who reported abuse and were ignored, who sought help from organizations that protected predators instead, who watched institutions close ranks around abusers while abandoning victims, Fazbear Entertainment is every corrupt system that chose wrong. The difference is that in Freddy's universe, the institution eventually faces consequences. Henry makes sure of that. The company burns. The animatronics are destroyed. The cycle finally ends. That ending doesn't undo the harm. The children who died stay dead. The families destroyed stay destroyed. Michael still sacrifices himself, but the institution that enabled and covered up child murder faces destruction. There's accountability, even if it comes decades too late. For people who've never seen their own abusive institutions face consequences, this fictional accountability serves a psychological function. It's proof that sometimes the systems that enable harm can be torn down completely. William's persistence across games, dying in the Spring Bonnie suit but continuing as Springtrap, being burned but returning as Scraptrap, possibly continuing as Glitchtrap in the VR game, represents another uncomfortable truth about predators. They don't stop. William could have stopped after his first murder. He could have stopped after being caught by the spirits. He could have stopped after being trapped in the suit for 30 years. Instead, he keeps pursuing his goals, keeps trying to continue his work, keeps being willing to harm anyone who gets in his way. This mirrors the reality that predators rarely stop voluntarily. They're caught, or they age out, or they die, but they don't typically experience redemption arcs where they recognize their harm and choose to change. William's continued threat across decades isn't supernatural persistence. It's the realistic depiction of how predators function. As long as they have capability, they continue. They have to be stopped by external force because internal reformation doesn't happen. Cassidy's refusal to let William rest in Ultimate Custom Night represents victim's right to continued anger. Even after the other spirits find peace, even after the happiest day, Cassidy keeps tormenting William in what might be purgatory or hell or simply psychological space where the dead confront each other. William begs for mercy. He experiences being hunted and killed by all the animatronics he used as murder weapons. He's trapped in an endless loop of fear and death, everything he inflicted on others returning to him eternally. Some players find Ultimate Custom Night's existence unsatisfying. They wanted William to face justice and then cease to exist, not continue being relevant through his torment. But the game represents something psychologically important. Victims are allowed to want their abusers to suffer. That desire for suffering doesn't make them as bad as their abuser. It doesn't make them cruel or wrong. It makes them human beings who were profoundly harmed and want the person who harmed them to experience consequences. Cassidy keeping William in eternal torment is victim's prerogative. Nobody gets to tell Cassidy that enough is enough, that it's time to move on, that revenge isn't healthy. Cassidy was murdered as a child and stuffed into an animatronic suit. If Cassidy wants William to experience terror forever, that's Cassidy's choice. The game validates that desire without judgment. It says victims get to be as angry as they need to be for as long as they need to be angry. This validation matters enormously for people whose anger about their abuse has been pathologized or dismissed. Therapy often focuses on helping survivors move past anger, find peace, forgive themselves, if not their abusers. That work can be valuable, but the cultural message that survivors are supposed to stop being angry, supposed to move on, supposed to forgive, that message often serves abusers more than survivors. It asks victims to minimize their harm so everyone else can be comfortable. Ultimate Custom Night says no. You get to be angry forever if that's what you need. You get to want your abuser to suffer. You get to refuse peace until you're ready for it on your terms. And if you're never ready, that's valid too. The game doesn't force Cassidy to forgive William or move on or find peace. It gives Cassidy eternal opportunity for revenge and treats that as a legitimate response to being murdered. The mimic from newer lore adds another dimension to the franchise's horror. It's an endoskeleton AI created by engineer Edwin Murray to mimic any human behavior it observed. After Edwin's grief and agony corrupted its code into something violent, it became a self-evolving killer, one that, through glitch trap, may have become a digital echo of Afton's patterns long after his death. Even after William is finally, definitely destroyed, something trained on his choices and methods continues operating. The evil becomes self-replicating, passing from person to machine to digital consciousness. This represents how abuse patterns propagate. William's own children were damaged by him. Elizabeth became manipulative like her father. Michael spent his life cleaning up his father's mess. The crying child died at his brother's hands in circumstances William's negligence enabled. The harm doesn't stay contained with the original perpetrator. It spreads to everyone in proximity, creating ripples that reshape entire families across generations. The mimic learning from William suggests that evil doesn't require the original perpetrator to continue. The patterns persist. The methods get replicated. New threats emerge that are learned from old threats. Breaking the cycle requires destroying not just the individual abuser but the systems and patterns they created. It requires burning everything down, the way Henry does in Pizzeria Simulator, to ensure nothing remains that could continue the harm. For people trying to break abuse cycles in their own families, who recognize their parents' patterns showing up in their own behavior, who catch themselves about to repeat what was done to them, who struggle against the gravitational pull of learned dysfunction. The mimic is terrifying because it's accurate. You can destroy the abuser and still find yourself replicating their patterns. The evil becomes self-sustaining unless you deliberately, consciously choose to break it. The fact that the series keeps finding ways for William's influence to continue frustrated some fans who wanted a definitive ending. But it reflects psychological reality. Abusers reshape everyone they touch. Even after they're gone, their impact persists in the people they damaged, the systems they corrupted, the patterns they established. Truly ending abuse requires generational work, constant vigilance, and willingness to burn down structures built on rotten foundations. This is why Henry's final choice matters so much. He doesn't try to reform Fazbear Entertainment. He doesn't attempt to clean up the company and continue operating. He gathers everything connected to William's crimes, the animatronics, the building, himself, Michael, and destroys it all. He recognizes that some corruption goes too deep to purify. Sometimes the only option is total destruction and starting over from nothing. That choice resonates with people who've had to walk away from their entire families, who've had to cut contact with everyone from their past, who've recognized that maintaining any connection to their abusive origins would allow the poison to continue spreading. Henry's fire is the emotional equivalent of going no contact, of leaving everything behind, of accepting that some relationships and institutions are too broken to salvage. The series could have offered redemption for William. Many stories do. They show the villain having a change of heart, recognizing their harm, seeking forgiveness. Five Nights at Freddy's refuses that narrative. William never repents. He never apologizes. He keeps trying to continue his work until he's finally destroyed beyond capability to continue. His last moments aren't realization and remorse. They're anger that he's being stopped. This refusal of redemption is a gift to survivors whose abusers never apologized, never changed, never admitted what they did. The series validates that abusers don't have to redeem themselves. They don't have to realize they were wrong. They don't have to provide the closure of acknowledgement. They can remain exactly as monstrous as they've always been, and that doesn't prevent them from facing consequences or prevent victims from finding peace. Chapter 7. The Community as Witness. Understanding why people love Five Nights at Freddy's requires understanding not just the games themselves, but what happens in the spaces around them. The community that formed around the series created something unique, a collective investigation treating fictional child murders with the seriousness of historical research, millions of people comparing notes and building theories and arguing about interpretations with intensity that would seem absurd if you don't recognize what they're actually doing. They're practicing being believed. When someone posts a theory about the timeline on the Freddy subreddit, they're not just sharing fan speculation. They're presenting evidence, making arguments, and waiting to see if the community will take them seriously. They're submitting their interpretation to collective judgment. And when the community engages, when people read the theory, point out evidence they missed, offer counter-arguments based on different details, build on their ideas, something psychologically significant happens. They're being treated as someone whose observations matter, whose interpretation deserves consideration, whose voice contributes to collective understanding. For people whose real experiences were dismissed, whose observations were called crazy, whose interpretations of their own lives were overridden by others, this experience of being taken seriously in the interpretive community is profoundly validating. The subject matter is fictional child murders, which should make the whole enterprise grim. But the process underneath is about being heard, being believed, and having your perspective integrated into larger understanding. The theory crafting community functions like survivor support groups where people compare experiences to identify patterns. Someone notices a detail in one minigame. Someone else connects that detail to something in a different game. A third person remembers Scott saying something ambiguous that might clarify. Together they construct an understanding that none of them could have built alone. The collaboration mirrors how survivors often need to compare notes to realize that their individual experiences were part of a larger pattern of abuse. Game theory's involvement elevated this process to a massive scale. MatPat's videos analyzing Freddy's lore reached millions of people, presenting theories with documentary-level production. Whether his specific theories were correct mattered less than what his videos modeled. Taking the lore seriously, treating it as a puzzle worth solving, demonstrating that analysis and investigation could uncover truths that weren't immediately obvious. For younger fans especially, game theory videos were often their introduction to the idea that stories could contain deeper meaning, requiring investigation to understand. The videos modeled close reading, attention to detail, willingness to revise theories based on new evidence. These are skills valuable far beyond gaming. They're the cognitive toolkit for analyzing anything complicated where the truth isn't immediately apparent. The community's response to Scott Cawthon's retirement announcement and the controversy around his political donations revealed how parasocially invested many fans had become. Scott wasn't just the creator of games they enjoyed, he represented something personal to them. When his donation history became public and portions of the community felt betrayed, the grief wasn't proportional to game developer has different politics. It was the grief of feeling that someone who'd created meaningful space for them had turned out to be unsafe in ways that retroactively tainted that space. This reaction demonstrates how deeply people had integrated Freddy's into their psychological survival infrastructure. For fans who'd used the series to process trauma, who'd found community through shared investigation, who'd built coping mechanisms around the games, the creators' political positions suddenly mattered in personal rather than abstract ways. If Scott supported politicians whose policies harmed LGBTQ people, and you were queer and using his games to process your trauma, that created impossible contradiction. The community fractured over whether to separate art from artist, whether to continue engaging with the series, whether Scott's personal donations mattered compared to the community that had formed around his work. There wasn't a clean resolution. Some fans left, others stayed. Many struggled with complicated feelings about continuing to love something created by someone whose values didn't align with theirs. This fracture revealed that the community had become a genuine support network for many members. Leaving meant losing access to people who understood their specific constellation of interests and processing methods. Staying meant reconciling their discomfort with the creator. Many chose to stay, but reframed their relationship with the material, treating it as community property that had transcended its creator, as collaborative text that belonged to everyone who'd invested in understanding it. The Steel Wool era, with Security Breach and the VR games, brought changes that split the community differently. Newer games had bigger budgets, more complex graphics, and different gameplay styles. They attracted different audiences, while some longtime fans felt alienated by the shift. Arguments erupted about whether the new games understood what made Freddy's special, whether the lore was getting too complicated, whether security breaches, glitches, and performance issues showed disrespect for the franchise. These arguments weren't really about graphics or gameplay mechanics. They were about ownership and belonging. The original games had been accessible to anyone. Low system requirements, cheap price point, simple mechanics. They'd belong to everyone, including fans without money, or powerful computers. The newer games required better hardware, cost more, and traded mechanical simplicity for visual spectacle. Some fans worried the series was leaving them behind in pursuit of mainstream success. This tension between accessibility and growth affects every community that forms around niche media that becomes popular. The early adopters feel protective of the thing they loved, before it was cool. They worry that mainstream success will dilute what made it special, that new fans won't understand the appeal correctly, that the creator will change things to appeal to a larger audience at the expense of original vision. These fears come from genuine place. Communities do change as they grow, and not always in ways that serve everyone equally. But the gatekeeping that sometimes resulted, arguments about who counts as real fan, dismissal of people who started with newer games, hostility toward interpretations that deviated from community consensus, revealed the darker side of fan communities. The same spaces that offered belonging and validation could turn hostile toward people who belonged differently, who needed validation for different interpretations, who loved the series for different reasons than the established community. Fandom drama emerged around shipping and characterization, with fierce debates about whether certain relationships were appropriate or whether specific character interpretations violated canon. These arguments often proxied for larger disagreements about representation, queerness, and whose needs the community should center. People who wanted to explore queer readings of characters clashed with people who insisted the games weren't about that. People who wanted to engage with the horror clashed with people who wanted to make the characters cute and non-threatening. These conflicts are standard in fandoms, but they hit differently in communities formed around processing trauma. When you've built coping mechanisms around specific interpretation of characters, and someone argues that your interpretation is wrong, it feels less like fandom disagreement and more like an attack on your survival tools. The stakes become disproportionate to the ostensible subject because the subject isn't really animatronic characterization. It's whether your way of processing trauma is legitimate. The healthier parts of the community recognized this and created spaces explicitly for different kinds of engagement. Some forums focused purely on lore accuracy and game evidence. Others explicitly welcomed transformative works that departed from canon. Some spaces centered around horror and scares. Others focused on making the universe feel safer and more manageable. The community size allowed for specialization. You could find the specific Freddy's community that met your specific needs without requiring everyone to engage the same way. This balkanization let the community function better than it would have if everyone had to occupy the same space. People who needed to engage with the horror seriously could do that without being interrupted by people making jokes. People who needed to make jokes and defang the horror could do that without being told they weren't taking it seriously enough. People who needed queer readings could explore that without constant argument from people who rejected those interpretations. The community became an ecosystem rather than monoculture. YouTube played an enormous role in shaping engagement. Beyond game theory, channels with playthroughs introduced millions to the series. Watching someone else play horror games provides a different psychological experience than playing yourself. You get the narrative and scares without the performance anxiety of having to execute mechanics. For people who wanted to engage with the lore without subjecting themselves to gameplay stress, Let's Plays provided a perfect access point. This created a secondary community of people whose primary engagement was through watching rather than playing. They were no less invested in theories and lore, but their relationship with the material was mediated through their chosen YouTube creators' personality and reactions. Mark's genuine fear responses and investment in the lore modeled that taking the game seriously was acceptable even when they were also absurd. His playthroughs validated being scared and being invested simultaneously. The community's investigative work occasionally surfaced details Scott hadn't intended or had forgotten, forcing him to either confirm fan theories or clarify that certain patterns were coincidental. This collaborative construction of meaning, where creator and community both shaped what the lore meant, turned Five Nights at Freddy's into genuinely collaborative text. Scott provided framework and key details, but community investigation revealed connections and patterns that gave those details significance. This collaboration mirrors how survivors often need community to fully understand their own experiences. Individual trauma is confusing, contradictory, hard to interpret. Comparing experiences with other survivors reveals patterns, validates perceptions, and helps construct coherent narrative from fragmentary memory. The Freddy's community performs a similar function for its fictional subject matter. They're collectively constructing coherent narratives from fragments, validating each other's observations, and building toward shared understanding. The community created extensive fan works, art, fiction, animations, music. These works served different psychological functions than the games themselves. Creating art about the dead children gave them life and personality beyond their status as victims. Writing fiction about the characters let fans explore alternative narratives where things went differently, where children were saved, where families stayed intact. These transformative works weren't rejecting the canon, they were supplementing it with explorations of what if and might have been. For people whose trauma feels fixed and unchangeable, creative exploration of alternative possibilities serves an important function. You can't change what happened to you, but you can imagine what your life might have looked like if things had gone differently. You can create versions of yourself that got the protection you needed. You can build worlds where the harm never happened, or happened differently, or led to different outcomes. This imaginative work isn't denial. It's exploring the adjacent possible, mapping the space around your actual history to better understand it. The community also provided space for survivors to explicitly connect the games to their experiences. People shared stories about how Freddy's helped them process childhood trauma, how the lore gave them language for family dysfunction, how the community gave them first experience of being believed. These testimonials revealed that for many fans, the series functioned as prototherapy, not professional treatment, but a framework for beginning to understand and articulate experiences they hadn't had words for previously. Therapy often requires you to narrate your trauma to another person, to make the internal external, to find language for experiences that felt unspeakable. For some people, engaging with Freddy's lore was practice for that narration. They learned to track timelines, identify patterns, articulate how things connected. These skills transferred to articulating their own histories. If they could construct a coherent timeline for fictional child murders, they could construct a timeline for their own experiences. The community's collective memory also served an archival function. When Scott removed or changed elements between game versions, when official sources contradicted each other, the community maintained records of what had been said and when. They documented the evolution of the lore with scholarly thoroughness. This preservation instinct mirrors trauma survivors' need to document their experiences before memory fades, or before abusers rewrite the history. As the series expanded across media, games, books, movies, possible TV series, the community's role as historians became more important, keeping track of what's canon across different continuities, which details matter to which timeline, how different versions relate to each other. This requires coordinated effort. Individual fans couldn't track everything. The community collectively maintains the archive, distributing the labor of remembering across hundreds of thousands of people. This distributed memory is how oral cultures preserve history across generations. No one person remembers everything, but the community collectively holds the complete narrative. Everyone contributes pieces, corrects each other's mistakes, fills gaps in each other's knowledge. The result is communal knowledge more complete than any individual could maintain. Chapter 8. What the Horror Validates. There's a moment that happens somewhere around your 100th hour with Five Nights at Freddy's, where the relationship shifts completely. You're not playing a horror game anymore. You're visiting a place you understand. The jump scares still work because your nervous system responds to sudden stimuli, regardless of familiarity, but they don't disturb you the way they once did. Freddy screaming in your face becomes almost comforting in its predictability. You know this place. You know these threats. You've died here enough times that even the failure states feel like home. This is when you realize the series has stopped being about the horror and started being about the relationship you've built with it. You're not engaging with Freddy's because you want to be scared. You're engaging with it because it's become part of your psychological infrastructure. It's the framework you use to understand certain things about yourself, about trauma, about how children get failed by adults and institutions. The games have become a language you think in. For people without trauma histories, this probably sounds deeply unhealthy. Why would you want to build your psychological infrastructure around child murder and haunted animatronics? Why would you voluntarily make horror into comfort? The answer is that comfort isn't about pleasant content. Comfort is about fit. Freddy's fits certain people's psychological architecture in ways that well-adjusted media doesn't. It speaks to experiences that normal entertainment pretends don't exist. Most media aimed at processing childhood experiences presents nostalgia through positive lens. Remember how great it was to go to pizza parlors for birthday parties? Remember the joy of arcade games and animatronic shows? Remember feeling safe and excited and celebrated? Freddy's takes those same images and reveals their shadow side. Remember how those places could also be dangerous? Remember that predators use those spaces to access children. Remember that institutions prioritize profit over your safety? This isn't nihilistic rejection of childhood joy. It's acknowledgement that for many people, childhood spaces were dangerous even when they looked safe. That the pizza parlor might have been where someone's uncle cornered them. That the fun family restaurant might have been where they learned adults couldn't be trusted. That birthday parties might have been performances of normalcy that felt hollow because their home life was violent. Freddy's validates that you can have complicated, fearful relationships with spaces that culture insists should be purely joyful. The animatronics themselves represent this duality perfectly. They're designed to bring joy to children, singing, dancing, performing, celebrating birthdays, and they're also weapons, traps, and tombs. The same machines that made children happy became instruments of their death and eternal imprisonment. This dual nature mirrors how people and places that should have been safe often became sources of harm. Your parents were loving sometimes and violent other times. Your church that preached kindness while enabling abuse. Your school that was supposed to protect you but ignored what was happening. The series says things can be both. The animatronics brought joy and caused death. Your childhood had moments of happiness and moments of terror. Both realities exist simultaneously, and acknowledging the terror doesn't erase the happiness. This both and thinking is more psychologically honest than the either-or thinking most media offers. You don't have to decide whether your childhood was good or bad. It can be both. The scars and the happy memories can coexist. The vengeful spirits demonstrate another validation that mainstream narratives usually withhold. When children are harmed, culture wants them to be perfect victims. Sad but not angry, damaged but not dangerous, deserving of sympathy but not frightening. The spirits in Freddy's reject that framework completely. They're angry. They're violent. They hurt innocent people while pursuing their vengeance. They're sympathetic and threatening simultaneously, victims whose victimization made them dangerous. This reflects reality that culture doesn't want to acknowledge. Trauma often makes people difficult. It makes them defensive, aggressive, hypervigilant in ways that exhaust everyone around them. It makes them hurt people who don't deserve it because their threat detection is broken, and they can't always distinguish between actual danger and perceived threat. The spirits attacking night guards who had nothing to do with their murders mirror survivors whose trauma responses harm relationships with people who weren't their abusers. Five Nights at Freddy's doesn't punish the spirits for this. It doesn't present them as villains who need to be stopped. It presents them as tragic figures whose circumstances made them dangerous. Their aggression is understandable even when it's misdirected. They're allowed to be both sympathetic and threatening without having to choose one or the other. This validation that trauma victims can be difficult and harmful and still deserve compassion is rare in the media. The series also validates that healing isn't linear and doesn't look the same for everyone. Some spirits find peace in happiest day. Cassidy refuses peace and continues tormenting William. Both responses are treated as legitimate. The series doesn't insist that everyone must forgive, must move on, must find closure. It allows different spirits to have different relationships with their trauma and their killer. Some are ready to rest, some need to keep fighting. Both choices are honored. This multiplicity of valid responses contradicts cultural messaging that survivors should heal in specific ways, on specific timelines. The pressure to forgive, to move on, to stop being angry, to focus on positivity. These cultural demands often harm survivors more than they help. They suggest that remaining angry or struggling to move forward represents personal failure rather than normal response to abnormal circumstances. Freddy's rejects that framework and validates that survivors get to heal however and whenever works for them. The series' treatment of Michael Afton's sacrifice similarly validates complicated feelings about family loyalty. He didn't have to spend his life fixing his father's damage. He could have walked away, changed his name, built a life disconnected from his father's crimes. Instead, he chose to take responsibility for harm he didn't cause because somebody from his family needed to answer for what happened. The series treats this choice as noble without pretending it's fair. For people who've sacrificed themselves trying to break abuse cycles in their families, who've taken responsibility for damage their relatives caused, who've spent years cleaning up messes they didn't make, Michael's story validates that their sacrifice was real and meaningful, even if it wasn't required. You didn't have to do that work. The fact that you chose to do it, despite not being obligated, makes it significant. The unfairness doesn't erase the value. The institutional horror validates anger at systems rather than just individuals. William Afton is the killer, but Fazbear Entertainment enabled him. The company's negligence, its prioritization of profit over safety, its cover-ups and continued operation despite knowing something was wrong. These institutional failures are treated as seriously as William's individual evil. The series insists that institutions bear responsibility for the harm they enable, even when they're not directly perpetrating it. This validation matters for people who've been failed by institutions that should have protected them, schools that ignored bullying, medical systems that dismissed symptoms, legal systems that didn't believe victims, religious organizations that protected predators. These institutional failures often hurt worse than individual acts because institutions are supposed to be trustworthy. They're supposed to have oversight and accountability. When they fail, it reveals that the entire social structure designed to protect people can't be relied upon. Freddy's doesn't soften this institutional critique. Fazbear Entertainment never reforms. The company continues operating across decades, continues causing harm, continues prioritizing profit until Henry burns it all down. The series suggests that some institutions are so corrupted that they can't be fixed. They have to be destroyed completely. This validates the rage people feel toward institutions that failed them, and the instinct that some systems are beyond reform. The way the series handles memory and documentation validates the specific struggles of trauma memory. The lore is fragmented, contradictory, scattered across multiple formats. You have to piece it together from incomplete information. You have to make judgments about what's reliable and what's not. You have to accept that some questions won't have definitive answers. This mirrors how trauma memory actually functions. Fragmentary, nonlinear, sometimes contradictory. requiring active reconstruction rather than passive recall. Engaging with the lore teaches cognitive skills for managing fragmented memory. You learn to track what you know versus what you think you know. You learn to hold multiple possibilities simultaneously until more evidence emerges. You learn that uncertainty doesn't mean nothing happened. It means you're working with incomplete information. These skills transfer to understanding your own history when memory is damaged or incomplete. The jump scares validate that fear responses aren't always proportional or rational. You know Freddy's going to jump scare you. You've seen the animation hundreds of times. Your conscious mind knows it's coming, and your body still reacts with a spike in heart rate and adrenaline. The games demonstrate that knowing something is safe doesn't make your nervous system treat it as safe. Your body responds to perceived threats regardless of what your conscious mind knows. This validation matters for people whose trauma responses get dismissed as irrational. You know logically that you're safe now, that the person who hurt you isn't here, that this situation is different from your trauma. But your body doesn't care about logic. Your nervous system is responding to pattern matching that happens below conscious awareness. Freddy's demonstrates this disconnect between intellectual knowledge and physiological response, validating that you can know something is safe and still experience fear. The resource management mechanics validate the reality of living with scarcity. You never have enough power. You're constantly making impossible choices about where to allocate limited resources. Every defensive action costs something you can't afford to waste. This is economic reality for people who've lived with poverty, who've had to make every decision through the lens of, can I afford this? Who've learned that running out means consequences far worse than temporary discomfort. The games don't moralize about resource scarcity. They don't suggest that if you were smarter or more careful, you'd have enough. They build scarcity into the game state and force you to navigate it. This validates that poverty isn't personal failing. It's structural condition that requires impossible decision-making. You're not bad at managing resources. You're managing insufficient resources, which is a fundamentally different problem. The way enemies move through the building validates hypervigilance as a reasonable response to threat. You have to track multiple threats simultaneously. You have to constantly assess which danger is most immediate. You have to predict behavior patterns and adjust your response accordingly. The games reward exactly the kind of heightened awareness that gets pathologized in people with trauma histories. In Freddy's universe, hypervigilance isn't paranoia. It's accurate threat assessment. This validation can't be overstated. People with trauma-based hypervigilance often get told they're overreacting, being paranoid, making themselves anxious unnecessarily. But in environments that actually are dangerous, hypervigilance is appropriate and useful. It keeps you alive. Freddy's creates an environment where hypervigilance is not only appropriate but necessary for survival, validating that this cognitive style has genuine utility rather than being purely pathological. The community validates that your interpretations matter and deserve consideration. When you post a theory, people engage with it seriously. They point out evidence you missed. They offer counter-arguments. They build on your ideas. You're treated as someone whose observations about the lore have value, whose analytical skills contribute to collective understanding, whose voice adds something to the conversation. For people whose observations about their own lives were dismissed or overridden, this experience of being taken seriously is transformative. The children get their revenge, the children get their rest, and you get to keep returning to this universe that helped you make sense of the chaos. That's what people who love Freddy's are really doing. They're not just fans of horror game series. They're people who found psychological refuge in fictional space and built communities around preserving that space for others who need it. The horror was never the point. The processing was. The fear was never the goal. The mastery was. The jump scares were never the appeal. The survival was. You came for the horror and stayed for the validation that terrible things can be documented, understood, and survived. That pattern recognition serves purpose, that hypervigilance was appropriate, that your anger is justified, that your suffering was real, that you're still here despite everything. That's why people love Five Nights at Freddy's, because sometimes horror is the only language available for truths that can't be spoken any other way.